Hello and welcome to our next installment of notes. This set of notes is going to be all about the cell theory. Before we really get into the cell theory and what it is, we have to talk about one famous scientist, and that is Robert Hooke. You, throughout this course, do not need to know many scientists, but for some reason this guy always comes up on the SOL. So Robert Hooke is famous for terming the actual verbiage that we use, cell. So he came up with the term cell, and he did this by looking at a thin slice of cork, which is part of a plant, under a microscope. And when he looked, he saw this image, and when he saw it, he said, that kind of looks like a cell, like a prison cell, and that's that, right? Now we call them cells. They've always, for as long as I've known them, they've always been cells, and it's all because of this man who looked at a picture and said, hey man, that kind of looks familiar to me. So he is famous for coming up with the term cell in relation to what we think of as microscopic cells. Now, going into the cell theory, there are three parts. The first part of the cell theory states that all living things are made up of one or more cells. Pretty straightforward, right? We've talked about this. This is one of our characteristics of life. All living things are made up of one or more cells. So it's the basic unit of structure. We've got single-celled organisms. We've got multi-celled organisms. I sort of gave this answer away in the last slide, but to relate this part of the cell theory, so cell theory number one, relating it back to our characteristics of life, that would be, of course, all living things are made up of cells, the C in Mrs. Chang. If we move on to the second part of the cell theory, then we're talking about cells being the basic unit of function for multi- and single-celled organisms. So this idea is that the cells work together to produce some sort of function. So an example of this would be our muscle cells, right? Our muscle cells work together in our bodies to help our muscles move. And we have lots of different types of muscle cells. We have cardiac, that's our heart. We have skeletal, that's like typically what you think of as muscles, right? That would be like on your arms and on your legs. And then we have smooth muscle, which is like in your digestive system. So like your stomach and your intestines. But all of those muscle cells, even though they look very different from each other, well, maybe they don't look that different, but under a microscope, they do actually look quite different. They work together in the same way. They all come together and do what they need to do. In this case, it's expanding and contracting so that they can help produce this function that is necessary for these organisms. So our cardiac muscle cells expand and contract together to keep our heart beating. That is necessary to have an organism stay alive, right? As you are walking, your skeletal muscles expand and contract together. That's necessary so that organisms can move and get to where they need to go. So that is the second part of our cell theory. Now, how does this relate back to our characteristics of life? Think about the 8 characteristics that we've talked about and which one would best fit this part of the cell theory. If you said that all living things are made up of cells, good job. Yes, this is probably the best one to fit, but the idea here is that just because all living things are made up of cells, there are interactions between cells that make them able to complete the functions necessary for life. So even though it says all living things are made up of cells, even though that's clearly what the characteristic of life is, I want you to focus on the idea that cells and the organelles within the cells can interact to help maintain life. And our third part and final part of the cell theory states that cells come from other cells by cell reproduction, right? Cells do not just spontaneously appear, right? There's no poof, here's a cell, surprise, I'm here. That's not how it works. Cells have to come from another cell. So, like, if you cut your knee, the cells in your body will divide to replace those old cells. And so your cells will always just like grow, divide, reproduce to replace dead cells in your body to make sure that you are kind of working at your optimum, your best. Okay? And then let's see. Have you a guess onto what characteristic of life this would represent? Well, that should say cell theory number 3. So how does cell theory number 3 relate back to what we know about the characteristics of life? For this one, it's a double whammy. So all things reproduce, right? Because we talked about cells reproducing from themselves, right? They don't just magically appear. They have to come from a parent cell. But also all things grow and develop. And with this part of the cell theory, when cells are replacing old cells, and making sure that, you know, your body is maintaining its, you know, putting its best foot forward, its optimum health, that's going through growth and development as well. Okay, great job. I'll see you in class.